and welcome to People in Power. I'm Barbara Serra. On today's programme, breeding discontent.
We are creating a time bomb of discontent in Central Asia. And because the West is seen to be backing the dictatorship, that discontent will take an anti-Western turn.
With recent speculation that the West may not be winning the war in Afghanistan, many fear that the influence of a resurgent Taliban will spread to the neighbouring Central Asian republics of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. But critics of Central Asia's authoritarian governments argue that the problem doesn't stem from Afghanistan. Rather, it is localized oppression of political opponents and religious groups, which is sending more and more people into the arms of outlawed organizations. So, who's right? Michael Anderson reports now from a region where myth and reality are apt to become dangerously confused.
Tajikistan's Islamic Renaissance Party is the only legal Islamic party in Central Asia. Its leader Muhyiddin Kabiri worries that the West sees only two opposing groups in the region.
At the West, they don't see the third group, normal people, the moderate Islam. We never declared that our goal is Islamic government or Islamic ruling, but we want to be Islamic society. We want democratic country, democratic society, radical ideas in Central Asia region. It is coming from a wrong policy of authoritarian regimes.
Years of fraudulent elections in Tajikistan have left Kabiri and his party marginalized.
It's very difficult to be a lone Islamic political party in the region, to fight ideologically against Islamic radicals and also against secular regimes, authoritarian regimes. We are now under pressure from both sides. The people want us to be more radical, but you know, we are not only responsible for Islamic values, only we are responsible for stability, for peace in our country.
In Soviet times, the northern Tajik town of Khujand was called Lenin Abad, and grazing your cow in front of his statue would have landed you in prison. Today, Tajikistan is ruled by Emomali Rahmon. Like the rest of Central Asia's dictators, he portrays himself as his people's anti-terrorist champion, cheered by school children, ordered onto the streets whenever he visits. Today another court case starts, but as always behind closed doors. Jamshed Saburov is the court-appointed lawyer for one of the accused. He has still not met his client, who faces 25 years in prison.
Вы не хотите мне говорить, если даже вы встречались с ним или нет? Да. Встречались с ним, да? И что он сказал?
The conviction rate in terrorism cases in Central Asia is literally 100%. And hardly any lawyers dare to stage a serious defense for a terror suspect. In neighboring Kyrgyzstan, the southern town of Karasu is known as a center for political Islam in Central Asia. Even on days like today, thousands are braving the cold to come for Friday prayer, which often attracts 5,000 or 6,000 people, many of them from Uzbekistan, just on the other side of the river. Living a few hundred meters from the mosque, Dilyor is one of the leaders of the political party Hizb ut-Tahrir in Kyrgyzstan. In all of Central Asia, the party is outlawed, declared a terrorist organization.
Hizb ut-Tahrir такими деяниями не занимается.
Точно?
Точно.
In truth, to date, there has been no proof of Hizb ut-Tahrir being involved in violence. In Kyrgyzstan, experts estimate there are maybe 8,000 members, in Uzbekistan several times more, working secretly in small groups.
После этих событий членов Хизб ут-Тахрира очень стало много. Молодежь интересуется. Историю открываем, обучаем. Да? Мухаммад, саллаллаху алейхи вассалям, что сделал в истории? Он сразу согласится же.
Experts are now warning that throwing thousands of discontented Muslims in prison is seriously counterproductive, as the prisons have now become a breeding ground for Hizb ut-Tahrir. Dilyor himself recently got out after 4 years inside.
Вот в тюрьме такие люди есть, да? Они очень здравомыслящие. И там такая огромная армия, наверное, будет, я думаю. Они ничего не боятся. Очень скоро будет исламское государство.
Оружие, насилие не играет роль?
Нет. Нет.
In Kyrgyzstan, the State Agency of Religious Affairs strictly controls the practice of Islam in the country, the hiring and firing of imams, controlling the building of mosques and religious education. Kanibek Mamataliyev, an expert at the agency, believes a hard approach now is necessary.
По всей Центральной Азии идет определенный процесс радикализации религии. Раньше, если было всего 39 мечетей, например, в республике, то сейчас их более 1700.
Одна большая важная причина – это отсутствие демократии.
Нет, мы не можем говорить об отсутствии демократии. Мы выбрали для себя выбрали что? Прежде всего, именно соблюдение прав человека. Но давайте начнем с того, что демократию понимает каждый по-разному. Если, например, человек понимает религию, как бросить бомбу куда-то, да, за свои идеи, нам нужна такая религия? У нас решением Верховного суда она причислена к экстремистским организациям и запрещена. Вот если, допустим, организация не хочет совершить плохое, а зачем ей тогда собирать оружие, гранаты? Конечно.
Нашли оружие у хизбутов?
Нет, у приверженцев этой организации было обнаружено оружие.
In late 2008, 32 people in the town of Noukat were given prison sentences of 17 to 20 years for belonging to Hizb ut-Tahrir and for having protested when the government cancelled the celebration of an important religious holiday.
Такие умные люди, да, судьи, которые, допустим, этот процесс прошел 3 инстанции. И если в 3 инстанциях в конечном итоге сказали, что люди, да, виноваты, я считаю, что для нас судебное решение в любом государстве законом является.
Sadiq Khan Mahmudov is a lawyer who defended some of the 32 people convicted.
Начали кидать камни, там несколько стекол были поломаны в здании госадминистрации. 2 машины были повреждены. Вот террорист, да, террорист. Террорист – это человек, который с оружием в руках борется против кого-то или против чего-то. Обязательно должно быть оружие.
Independent experts agree that this was only a case of spontaneous local disturbances. Nevertheless, the judge sentenced 32 people to between 17 and 20 years in prison.
Потому что многие из них там не было. Абсолютно никаких доказательств, что они совершили какое-то там преступление, нету. Несколько человек, больше 10 человек, они вообще там не были. Я защищал от отца и сына Машрабовой. Они в то время, когда вот это вот мероприятие проходило, они были на поле, пшеницу сеяли. Есть свидетели, получили сроки, это обыкновенные колхозники. Какие могут быть планы у колхозника? Это же вообще абсурд. Вот. Хотели как бы предупредить, если будут вот такие вот выступления, значит, государство будет действовать так. Сейчас уже вот этой демократии уже почти нету. Я бы хотел узнать, вот, чем может международное сообщество помочь в этом вопросе.
As the situation in Afghanistan deteriorates, fears are growing here in Central Asia that a return to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan will lead to instability in Central Asia. Madina is 7 years old and lives with her family in southern Tajikistan, almost on the border with Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. Her father, Sherali, is a terrorist, or at least that is what the government of Uzbekistan alleges.
Очень умный и красивый парень был. У него желание осталось, чтобы учиться на это. Ну, иностранный Ирана. Остальные учебы продолжали на Пакистане. Только у него желание только было учиться, больше ничего. У нас нет, мы бедные люди. Бедные крестьянские люди мы.
Sherali's monthly phone calls home suddenly stopped, and they heard nothing for 3 years. Until June 2009, when a letter from Sherali arrived. He was in prison in neighboring Uzbekistan. According to the Uzbek police, Sherali has confessed to being trained by Al-Qaeda to bomb a German military base in Uzbekistan. But the UN says that torture in Uzbekistan is systematic. Each year, hundreds confess to crimes they never committed.
Нет, такого не было, вообще не было. Нет, такого слова вообще мы не слышали и не разговаривали. Нет, этого ничего нам не известно за этого, да, неизвестно. Как он попал на Узбекистан, как его подсудили, ну, деревни собирали из мечети, да, отец. Да, помогли люди.
Там солдаты сюда ходили, вот там на ухо так сказал, отец так нельзя говорить.
In fact, Sherali's brother already knew, as I did, that Sherali had been sentenced to 19 years for terrorism, but he feared telling his elderly parents.
Когда Бог что может разрешить, мы оттуда поедем домой. Вот так.
Это значит, вы не знаете, сколько он там будет?
Не знаем, да, не знаем.
И у него нет защиты, я имею в виду, адвокат? У него нет или как?
Нет, адвоката у нас нет. Бедные люди, откуда адвокаты? Ну, на хлебе еле-еле найдем.
Мне говорили, отец, если сейчас в следующий раз приедете, мне жена, дочка привезите.
We will probably never know the truth about Sherali, and neither will his family. Was he trained by Al-Qaeda, or was he no more than a devoted Muslim tortured into a confession? Central Asia is now nervously watching the South. President Obama's expressed intention to leave Afghanistan has direct bearing on them. I met up with Parviz Mullajanov, a Tajik analyst, while he was speaking at Oxford University.
If the Taliban gets into some kind of power in Afghanistan,
we will get the rise of extremist movements and instability inside Central Asian countries. There is no moderate Taliban, and they will never stop on the border of with Tajikistan or Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan. They always would try to push further.
The Taliban would find allies amongst the underground movements because decades of oppression in Central Asia have already pushed sections of society to the brink. And it is this discontent that is the real threat.
We have underground circles, Islamic circles of radical character. So they are becoming more and more strong because of the failure of economic and social strategies and reforming of the local governments.
The interior ministers and directors of the intelligence services from Central Asia, Russia and China were meeting to discuss the threat. None of them were willing to acknowledge that it is local oppression which more than anything else breeds dissent. Apart from one man whose speech was met with utter silence.
Good governance and respect for human rights lessens or lowers the threats from terrorism by reducing potential grievances on which terrorism can prey.
I think there's a direct relationship between failures in government, failures by authority, and the way in which people feel, which can find itself translated and directed towards more radical and violent means. Respect for those rights, even if someone's suspected of terrorism, must be observed. That is one big learning lesson that we've had from large detentions, be that Guantanamo or Bagram or wherever. Human rights, even in detention and during a trial process, must be respected. If you don't do that, you're multiplying the problems.
However, the foreign minister of Kyrgyzstan had a very different take on the situation.
Это не внутренняя проблема, это проблема, которая пришла к нам извне. Спасибо большое.
Uzbekistan has 10,000 religious and political prisoners, and both Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are now regularly sentencing large groups of so-called extremists. The regimes are dangerously out of touch with reality, says Parviz Mulajanov.
They don't understand Islam, they're afraid of Islam. The majority of advisors to presidents were teaching historical materialism, for instance, or some Marxism. They are not able to define where the extremists and where just devoted Muslim. In many cases, they suppress everybody. When you exert pressure on the moderate part of Islam, you would get something opposite. You would get the strengthening of those radical organizations, those underground radical circles.
His words were echoed by the Uzbek opposition, long ago forced into exile.
They have come here to Brussels to warn that the political oppression in Central Asia, conducted by the anti-democratic regimes there, is now leading to a radicalisation among still bigger parts of the population.
Their action came the very same day the European Union removed the last of the sanctions it had placed on Uzbekistan after the massacre in Andishan in 2005, when the Uzbek army killed 1,000 peaceful demonstrators, accusing them of being Islamic terrorists trying to overthrow the government. 20 years ago, when Uzbekistan gained its independence, Muhammad Sulih was the main challenger to Communist Party chief Islam Karimov. But Karimov quickly grabbed power and has held it ever since.
Каримов это сделал. Каримов создал тогда лживый образ исламского фундаментализма, который теперь стал явью, реальностью. Он сам это создал, это пугало. Этим пугалом пугает Запад, чтобы получить поддержку от Запада. Каримов нужен был им против России или против Китая. Сегодня радикальные, не только группы религиозные, не только оппозиционные, но и простые бизнесмены, учителя, рабочие, все пришли к черте, к сожалению, радикализма. Это я серьезно говорю. Сейчас очень взрывоопасная ситуация в Узбекистане сложилась. Работать в оппозиции в Узбекистане – это вопрос жизни и смерти, или смерти. То есть в буквальном смысле я говорю. Да, у меня сидят двое братьев, которые получили по 15 лет только потому, что они мои братья. Большинство верующие. То есть те мусульмане, которые сидят только потому, что они читают намаз. И никакие они не террористы.
The Uzbek opposition clearly feels betrayed by the West, not least the Obama administration.
К сожалению, получилось наоборот. Сегодня демократы более уступчивы к диктаторам, чем даже Буш. Отменяют эти санкции. Скорость репрессивной машины усилилась вдвое.
Craig Murray was the British ambassador to Uzbekistan as the West drew closer to the Karimov regime. Two things are absolutely clear, Murray says.
The first is that there will never be any reform as long as President Karimov is in power. And secondly, that Western governments actually do not care. They are perfectly happy to work with Karimov.
Murray was fired by Tony Blair for his public criticism of the West policies in Central Asia.
Of course, the Karimov regime would describe almost everybody in this room as terrorists. It suits the West sometimes to pretend to believe them.
Karimov, Qatil! Stop dictator Karimov! Stop dictator Karimov! Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illa.
Worshippers flocked to the central mosque in the Tajik capital to celebrate Qubanate, one of the main Muslim holidays.
The version of Islam they celebrate here is a much more relaxed and soft one than in other places. In fact, many of these people will go home and celebrate Qubanate with vodka and beer and pork.
Nevertheless, the West has willingly bought into the fear-mongering that has kept the regimes in Central Asia in power for so long.
Sadly, there's no evidence at all that the West is serious about the human rights and democracy, or that it affects their foreign policy. I think the overwhelming interest is in the war in Afghanistan. We are creating a time bomb of discontent in Central Asia. And because the West is seen to be backing the dictatorship, that discontent will take an anti-Western turn.
Well, that's it for this edition of People and Power. If you'd like to comment on our report or any other matter, we'd love to hear from you. Do get in touch on aljazeera.net/English. Until next time, bye-bye.